All right, we're going to take a look in this lesson at the characteristics of living things, and we're going to look at, to begin with, kind of a definition of biology, since this is the class that you are in. To begin with, bio, means life or living. Ology means the study of something, so biology is the study of living things or of life. Living things are called organisms. So it's not really appropriate to say that something is a living organism because that's kind of a redundant term. If something is an organism, it's automatically living. All right, now defining life or defining what is living gets a little bit tricky. And this is a problem because if we're going to study life or living things, we have to be able to define what we mean by what we're studying. And the reason why this is tricky is because if you asked 50 different scientists how to define living or life, you would get 50 different answers. And that's simply because people put emphasis on different things as being important, whereas other things maybe are less important. And somebody else might disagree with that. So the compromise is to come up with a set of characteristics. And if something has all those characteristics, and only if it has all of those characteristics, do we consider it to be an organism. It is possible that something could have, say, 4 characteristics and be missing 1 characteristic, or maybe have 2 of the characteristics but none of the others. We still don't call those things organisms unless they have all of the characteristics. So let's take a look at all of these characteristics. Now bear in mind, if you look this up on the internet or if you looked at different textbooks, you would have a different number of characteristics, anywhere between 5 and 8 characteristics. Sometimes some people will lump together characteristics and then sometimes they separate them all out. I've got a few of them lumped together, but for now we're just going to look at 6. The first of these characteristics is organization. Organisms are organized, and the way that they're organized is into cells, and cells must contain DNA. So to define a couple terms here, cells are the smallest things, parts of living things that are themselves living, meaning I could isolate one of your body cells and I could put it in a little petri dish in a lab and I could keep it alive in the laboratory. So that's what makes it the smallest unit of you that's still alive. Now, does that mean there's nothing smaller than a cell? No, that's not true. There are smaller things, but cells are the first thing that is actually alive as part of you. Now, when we're talking about cells, keep in mind that there are 2 types. The first type are the prokaryotic cells, and for now, let's just call those the simple cells. There are also more complex cells that we call eukaryotic, and you can see on the bottom, I've included a couple pictures here. Here's a eukaryotic cell. It's a big cell. It's got all these little parts inside, so it's a lot more complex than this little prokaryote. What's not shown very well in this diagram is the size difference between them. Prokaryotes, because they are so simple, tend to be really, really small. The prokaryotes are all bacteria, and they're all single cellular. Now remember, the next part of organization is that the cells all contain DNA. Now this picture shows a eukaryotic cell, which means its DNA is inside of the nucleus. In a prokaryotic cell there is no nucleus, but the DNA is free-floating kind of inside of the cell. So remember that DNA is this molecule right here. It's that double helix, that twisted ladder. And that DNA is the genetic material inside of the cell. So this is what is the code for building your cells, making new parts to you. It's also what you pass on to your kids when you have kids. Now, that leads us, remember I said that the cell is the smallest living unit of living things. And I said also that there is such a thing as smaller parts as well. And so that leads us to this hierarchy of organization here. And remember that a hierarchy is an order to something. So when we put things in order, usually by size, then we're dealing with a hierarchy. So our hierarchy is going to start with the smallest thing over here, and we're going to go in this direction until we end up with the largest category right here. Bear in mind also, there are things smaller than the smallest thing that I have listed here, and there are things larger than the largest thing I have listed here. But this gives us a good sampling of how living things fit into the scope of some things that you're familiar with. So first of all, you have atoms. Okay, so atoms are small particles of elements, and they make up molecules. So when you start bonding atoms together, you get a molecule. You can even take smaller molecules and you can bind them to make macromolecules, and hopefully you know that macro means large. You also have organelles. That's what you get when you add a bunch of macromolecules together and bind them together in different ways. You get organelles, which are the internal parts of cells. And all cells have some organelles. The prokaryotes are just going to have less organelles. Then these organelles make up cells. And again, where does the living begin? The living begins right here with cells. So up until this point, all these other things smaller than cells aren't living, but they make up cells. Okay, so they are important to cells in our study of biology. But the living begins right here with cell. Cells put together to do a job are called tissues. Tissues put together to do a bigger job are called organs. And when you have one large function in an organism that is done by a number of organs, then you have what's called an organ system. Organ systems put together make the whole organism, and a bunch of organisms put together that are alike are called a species. Now, bear in mind also that this hierarchy gives us a clue to the complexity of an organism. If you looked at a bacteria, or even a more complicated cell like an algae, which is eukaryotic, it's unicellular, right? So it would go through the hierarchy up until this point to cell. And then notice, if you're unicellular, you don't have tissues, organs, and organ systems. You just skip all of those things and go right to the organism. So multicellular organisms are more complex because they have a few more steps in this hierarchy of organization. So that's kind of what lends to the complexity of those species. The next characteristic is reproduction. Reproduction is the only one of these characteristics that you don't actually have to do and still be considered living. You just have to be capable of doing it. So while most of you have not reproduced, I hope, you're still eventually going to be capable of reproducing, which is why you're still considered to be living. So reproduction is necessary for the species. Now, while we're on this topic, we've brought up the term species a couple times, so let's define that. This is the biological species definition. It's a group of individuals that are closely related, and if you mate them, they will produce a fertile offspring. Fertile offspring means that those babies that they produce will grow up to have their own babies. So we know that all humans on the planet are in the same species because you can take any two people from anywhere all over planet Earth, and if you put them together and they mate, they can produce a baby, and that baby can produce its own babies one day. We know that things like donkeys and horses are different species because if we mate a donkey and a horse, it will produce an offspring, but it produces what we call a sterile hybrid. It produces a mule, and that mule is not capable of reproducing itself. So because it can reproduce, but it reproduces something that's sterile, we still consider those to be two different species. Also note that there are two different kinds of reproduction in organisms. A lot of organisms do sexual reproduction, and at the base level, sexual reproduction is simply combining DNA from two different organisms. In humans, that's a mom and a dad bring their DNA together with the sperm and the egg to produce a baby, and then that baby is going to have half of the DNA from mom's egg and half from dad's sperm. It's not necessarily accomplished with sperm and egg all over the organisms on planet Earth, but in sexual reproduction, whether you're talking about a plant or a mushroom or a fish or even a human, you're still dealing with combining DNA from two individuals. Asexual reproduction is a cloning process. It's a natural copying process where one individual copies itself, and therefore the baby that results from that is 100% the DNA of that one parent who copied itself. So there's no genetic recombination here. It's simply a copying process. It's not a popular choice for organisms, but some will reproduce asexually. There are a few organisms that can do both, but most choose either sexual or asexual. Continuing, you've got growth and development. Sometimes these are split up, but I like to talk about these together because they are so closely related. They both happen kind of at the same time. Growth obviously is getting bigger. That's where you are producing, as you get larger, new cells and increasing your body mass. That's part of the equation, but remember, you don't look exactly as you did when you were a baby, right? You're not just a large baby. You've made some changes to your face and to your body and so on. That stuff we call development. So development is a maturation process. That's where you're going from an infant form that's not capable of reproduction yet to an adult form that is capable of reproduction. So these two things go hand in hand and are related to one another. So it's important that you think of them kind of together. The next characteristic is homeostasis. If you break this down, you see that homo means same, right, and static means unchanging. So literally this word means same, unchanging. What this is saying really, even though that's kind of a confusing way to put the word, is that organisms have a set of stable, constant internal conditions. And it's kind of like thinking of it as the body in balance. So your body temperature should be a steady 98.6. You should have a certain blood glucose level that stays relatively steady. You should have 10 pints of blood circulating through your system at all times. Those are all steady things. When something happens and throws off that balance, your body's homeostatic mechanism will try to compensate and reestablish that balance. So examples of this are when your core temperature drops, you will shiver, and that generates heat in your muscles to try to raise your body core temperature. If your body core temperature gets too high, you'll sweat, and sweating is for evaporative cooling, to try to cool off. Same thing happens when you are exercising. Your oxygen demand in your blood gets higher, so you increase your heart rate and your breathing in response to that to try to bring your oxygen levels back up in the blood. Next one's easy, adaptation, right? Everybody knows what this is. This is a change in an organism or something different about the organism. It's not always something that the organism can control. Sometimes they're born with an adaptation. Sometimes, though, there are some behavioral things that the organism can do differently to survive in an environment. Adaptations are what contribute to natural selection. In other words, how a species overall can change. But again, that's not the organism changing. Now, there's also such a thing as an adaptation that's a simple response to a stimulus. So not all adaptations are big, grandiose things that would change a species. Sometimes they're just simple, small things that you do, like putting on your coat when you get cold, taking off your coat when you get hot, right? Animals can, say a lizard goes out into the sun and suns itself when it's cold, things like that. That's not going to change a whole species, but it is still an adaptation to the situation, and it does help the organism survive under those circumstances. All right, last thing. Organisms obtain and use energy, right? This is the thing that most students can really pick out at the beginning. Everything's got to eat or somehow get energy someplace, right? Understand that organisms have what we call a metabolism, and the metabolism is the chemical reactions that are going on inside of your body that produce that energy to carry out life functions. In order to fuel your metabolism, you have to get energy from the environment somehow. And there are two strategies for this. Organisms that we call autotrophs are known as the self-feeders or the producers because they can actually do photosynthesis. So they can actually generate these chemical energy molecules like glucose and other sugars by harnessing the sun's energy and using that to make those molecules. Finally, you have the heterotrophs. Heterotrophs, of course, mean the other feeders. We also call these guys the consumers because instead of making their own sugar molecules for energy, they have to get their sugar molecules by eating other things in order to survive. So you've got the producers and the consumers there, and those are the two strategies for getting energy. That's it. Those are the characteristics. So if something's alive, it's got to have all of those things. If it doesn't have all of those things, it's not alive. Pretty simple when you think about it, just making sure you're understanding some terms.